Really glad you could make it. We know schedules are really busy and sometimes it's hard to carve out time for learning and knowledge and investing time in yourself to learn something new. So today we're going to be talking about bright spots, what's working and how we can do more of it. If you've never heard of bright spots, that's okay. You're going to learn a new methodology today to help you solve challenges. But if you have heard of bright spots, that's okay too. We're going to be walking through some specific examples that are very unique to the fraternal community to help illustrate how you might be able to apply this method within your own organization. So my name is Charlotte Myler. I am the marketing leader for Bill Highway and Greek Bill, and I'm going to be your host today walking you through this framework. If at any point in time you have questions or comments, feel free to put those in the chat and we'll go ahead and get those answered for you. I do have Katie here on the back end who is going to be able to monitor that and make sure nothing gets missed. All right, so let's go ahead and dive in. So diving into what bright spots actually are, I want you to take a minute and imagine this. I don't know how report cards come home anymore. Maybe it's a portal, maybe they bring paper home. I don't have children, so I'm not sure how that process works today. But if your child were to bring home a report card that looked like this, what's your initial reaction? Where does your attention go? I'm guessing that it probably goes to this F here on the science line item. All you see is that big F. So your immediate response might be, well, maybe we should hire a tutor, or maybe we should take away their coveted PlayStation 5 that they just got. So if you are like most people, you switch into that problem-solving mode pretty quickly and quite naturally. But according to the authors that we're going to talk about in a minute here, Chip and Dan Heath, who wrote the book Switch, which is where the bright spots concept comes from, this is we're wired to focus on problems versus our strengths. So usually doing that and focusing on the problem works well enough. So for example, you could say with tutoring, we can get this F up to a B. But in certain scenarios, and especially in times of change, that's not usually the best mindset. And we know that all of us in the fraternal community are being faced with a lot of change. So what does that mean in chapter speak? Well, it means that when you look around at your chapters, it's natural to see challenges and problems everywhere. You could probably spend all day putting out fires and getting caught up in analysis paralysis with so many priorities and things going on. That's why sometimes taking the approach of focusing on what is working can lead to different results. And that's really what bright spots are all about. So what is a bright spot and why does it matter and why are we talking about it today? So chances are you've seen bright spots and you've possibly even acted on them without even knowing it, which is kind of a cool thing to know. So if you feel like you don't know or feel like you're behind, fear not, you've probably done it naturally. The concept comes from a book called Switch, which the brothers Chip and Dan Heath wrote, as I previously mentioned before. If you've read the book, I would love to hear what you thought of it. If not, definitely one you might want to check out. They also have another amazing one called The Power of Moments. And with the concept of power of moments, it can really align with membership and working with volunteers. So that's for another day. I'm not going to go down that wormhole. We're going to talk about Switch and bright spots. So the first thing to really note here is that the concept has been used to solve challenges that are both very large and challenges that are small. So just to give you a picture of how the concept works when applied to a large challenge, I'm actually going to share one of the key examples that they dive into from the book. And then from there, we're going to dive into examples that relate to the fraternal community. So in the book, they highlight a man who works for a health nonprofit, an international nonprofit, and he is sent to Vietnam, and he's tasked with solving malnutrition in parts of the country. If I was him, I think I would have been like, where do you even want me to begin? How do you go about this? This is a huge problem that people have been trying to solve for a very long time. So where do you start? And he used the concept of bright spots by starting in a small village. He took the measurements of all the children, and some were healthier than others. So he looked at the height and weight requirements for what a healthy child would be. And he started observing, and he was saying, well, of the kids that are meeting the height and weight requirements for their age and demographic, what's going on in their families and why aren't they suffering from malnutrition like some of the other families? So he started to observe how things were done, and he realized that most of the families worked in rice fields. And often the families ate 2 meals per day, with rice being the main staple. And that was standard across most of the families. So now he had a norm, a standard that he could work with. And he started saying, well, are there people that are doing something differently here? And what he noticed is that there were a couple of families that while they were out working in the rice paddies, they were harvesting shrimp and little crabs and that sort of thing. And they were adding it to the rice meals. And in addition to that, they were serving their kids meals 4 times a day versus 2. And lo and behold, when he, cross-referenced his data with the families that he had observed, harvesting the proteins, he found that those were the families that were not suffering from malnutrition. So what he was able to do was teach those other families who were only serving rice and 2 meals a day. He was able to take the families that were using the proteins and teach these other families how to harvest the proteins and how to cook and prepare multiple meals per day. So it was learning from their peers and people in their community versus somebody else coming in and saying, you're doing it wrong, or this is how you should be doing it. Because we all know learning from our peers is much easier and better received than somebody coming in who may not be of your community telling you what to do. So that's a large example of using the bright spot method. However, it can be used in much smaller cases, like I mentioned with the report card and helping parents motivate kids to study and get better grades. So you'll find that once you learn this concept of bright spots, you might start to see potential bright spots everywhere. And I was working with a client the other day where I was like, aha, this might be something. Like, let's dig into it and let's uncover it. And you might even find yourself thinking of it when you're in meetings and you hear other individuals speaking of a challenge or a problem. You might find yourself asking, well, do we know anyone who's doing it? And do we know anyone who's solved this? Or do we know anyone who's doing something different? And do we know what the results are? You really start to shift that mindset once you know and have learned of this concept. So what exactly is a bright spot? I think there's 3 key elements here that are critical to bright spots to understand before we dive into some of the examples. In a nutshell, bright spots are early glimmers of something that is working or going well. So think about the A on that report card, or the families cooking the meals with the shrimp and the crabs. They're usually described as early glimmers because it's usually a solution that hasn't been broadly shared yet. So you could think of them as maybe early innovators or early adopters. They're a little bit of that shiny spot that kind of catches your eye. We've actually, here on the Bill Highway and Great Bill side, we've been exploring this idea of bright spots in organizations with chapter networks since last fall. And we've found that most individuals that work with chapters or have chapter networks as part of their organization have a bit of a natural knack for finding bright spots and identifying them, which is awesome. And that's what you want. So if you feel like you have that natural knack, we want to show you how to harness it. And if this is your first time thinking about the concept, we want to show you what it is and how you can leverage it. So the second key element here is studying and cloning a bright spot, which means you're going to work to replicate something instead of focusing on the problem and trying to figure out where to solve it. A lot of times when you have a problem, you spend a lot of time throwing ideas out there, banging your head against the wall, trying to figure out what you can do to fix the problem. Well, when you have a bright spot, it's all about studying where the problem does not exist and then understand that current situation or process so that you can understand how to make it not happen. It's just taking the problem-solving methodologies and flipping it on its head a little bit. And the third element here is that it's important to note that bright spots can be particularly useful in times of change, which we've all been experiencing a lot of recently. I think the past year has probably been nothing but change. So it's very relevant to what we're experiencing today in today's society and in our own organizations. So it's kind of the perfect time for us to explore bright spots. So why we need them more than ever for chapter-based organizations. So let's think about your chapters and your chapter leaders for a minute. They're probably very overwhelmed. Your officers are dealing with a lot of different changes. There's been governance changes due to the pivot to virtual. The way they've operated has changed. we've seen so many of these standard practices that people have become accustomed to shift over the past year, and they're going to continue to shift and evolve in new and different ways. I think a lot of us can agree that things aren't just going to go back to normal in the same way they used to. Things are probably going to be a little bit different going forward. In the area of education has definitely shifted. The way that students are learning today, the way they're engaging with their education, the way that you provide education to your members, all of that has shifted. And it's just one more example of change and shifting a mindset or perspective or learning new tools. So that can definitely add a layer of stress. So even if something isn't particularly difficult, if it's unknown, it can be intimidating. Therefore, this is another reason why bright spots make sense for the times that we're in. Another area where there might be some overwhelm is engaging members. I mean, college students are already spending a lot of time online due to virtual classes, and it's hard to keep their attention in virtual meetings. So when they're already spending a good chunk of time in front of a screen, sometimes asking for more of that time outside of their essential classes can be difficult. So due to social distancing, we find that the in-person activities are still difficult, but we know that they're being permitted in more and more locations right now. So it'll be interesting to see how that changes, but how the framework may still come into play. Another area is that some chapters and organizations are finding it challenging to provide and explain their value to members in a virtual environment. Therefore, we know over the past year, members have withheld with paying dues, or some chapters have had to reduce their dues to accommodate for the virtual value and the lack of that in-person interaction, which has definitely impacted chapter cash flow, which makes it hard to deliver on additional value that requires budget. So the list goes on. There's a lot of different reasons why bright spots might make sense for your organization and the fraternal community as a whole right now. So the goal here is to find a win-win-win. And the really cool part about bright spots is they act as a morale booster and a prescriptive roadmap forward. Because the difference here is most problem-solving methodologies focus on the negatives. They say, we have a problem, we have to fix it. Instead, bright spots really shift your focus to the positive. You take all that energy and tasks around it when it comes to solving a problem, and you put it in a positive light, and you say, what's working? What's going right? How do we apply that to others so that they can benefit? And those are much more positive words and phrases and approaches versus when you focus on the negatives. It also provides that roadmap. So one of the pieces of the bright spot framework, as you will see, is that you look at replicating those positives and those bright spots and the things that are working. And they tend to be very prescriptive because you're taking a process or insights from one area that has worked and applying it to another. So the second thing here is that bright spots really come in the form of small and incremental changes versus large overhauls. So I mean, let's be really honest, like change management can be really difficult and very intimidating, but bright spots kind of open the door for opportunities to make tweaks and adjustments, which not only mitigates risk, but it makes room for error so much smaller while still potentially having a large impact. As I think we all know, coming to the table with a huge project, people often kind of put on the brakes, they ask a lot of questions, whereas if you can come at it from an incremental approach, people are going to be more open to trying small things versus big things. And the third thing here is that bright spots provide a roadmap from their peers, which immediately changes the conversation. It opens the door for connections and best practices in a way that sometimes you just don't have the insight to when you're not in an officer or advisor's shoes. It allows you to tap into the power of peer-to-peer connection, and you become the facilitator versus the teacher, which again changes that dynamic and allows people to open up and be more vulnerable to the possibilities. So when does it make sense to use the bright spot approach? There's 4 main areas in which it makes sense. So the first one is when your chapters are dealing with too many priorities and you can tell that they're stressed out or morale might be low. Because bright spots can be that roadmap, as we mentioned before, that can focus on the positives and help turn things around and kind of create that snowball effect. It gives them permission to focus on one thing And if they're using a model or a template or something that was created in the replication process to do so, they have more confidence because what you're teaching them has already worked somewhere else. There's a track record of success. So that they can have greater confidence that what they are learning about and what they're implementing has a track record of success and might work for them. The second time that a bright spot makes sense is when you're looking to change behavior. So if you need some support in the change management department here, bright spots can be your friend. It's kind of like the old proverb, give a man a fish, feed him for a day, and teach a man to fish, you feed him for a lifetime. A bright spot framework really empowers you to teach your chapters how to fish versus you having to continuously give them dinner, if that makes sense. And then the third thing here is that you find a common challenge. So if you find a common challenge that you've seen multiple different chapters experience, this situation might be prime for a bright spot problem solving methodology. That means that this might be a sign that you need to find a bright spot. So if you have a challenge where you're like, oh my gosh, I know that 75% of our chapters are struggling with X, go look at those other 25 and see if somebody has solved it, and then go from there. Because you can really brainstorm ideas all day long and throw dollars at things, but unless you can go out and actually identify a situation where the problem doesn't exist, you're going to save yourself a lot of time and energy and resources, and you're also going to create a more positive multiplier effect. And then the fourth and final time when a bright spot might make sense is if bright spots exist. So if you see a bright spot, use it. Maybe that bright spot doesn't solve the biggest challenge you have on your plate, but if you can incrementally just elevate chapters across the board, that positive impact can add up to a really large sum that makes it worth it. Like imagine if each chapter could increase membership by a couple percent. If each chapter could fundraise a few more $100 or $1,000 for the general fund. What would that mean for your bottom line? And what would that mean for the impact that your organization can have on your communities and your mission? So why are fraternities and sororities a great candidate for the bright spot model? The first off is you have the perfect sampling in front of you. You have chapters. You have this network of entities at each campus where you're located, and they're all fairly similar. Now, I do understand that there are subcultures and there are there's different sizes, different budgets. There are variables in the mix. However, you have relationships with those chapters, which is the second item here that makes you so primed to use this methodology, because you actually have access to all of your chapters to go ask these questions, to dig in and understand what's happening at the chapter level. And then thirdly, you have access to data. So majority of your organizations are on a solution, whether it be financial, membership-based, what have you. You have access to this data that can help you sift through and find bright spots. Now, it might not cover all the bright spot territory. There might still be things you need to go out and look for and understand, but know that because you have the organizational structure that you have, you're primed to use bright spots. So before we dive into the framework, ask yourself, when have you found a successful practice at one chapter and shared it with others? I'm sure you've done it before. You may not have understood it or understood that you were doing you were implementing the bright spot approach, but that's exactly what you were doing. So also ask yourself, what problems are chapters experiencing right now that could possibly be solved by a bright spot approach? And then also don't forget to think through, like, how could you use your network of other fraternity and sorority professionals to help you embark on a bright spot exercise? Because we're going to explore that in an activity that we're going to allow you to kind of walk away from this webinar with and think through for yourself. So finally, we're getting to the framework. It's important to set everything up and make sure that we cover all the backstory before we dive into this. So first we're going to walk you through the framework, and then I'm going to be walking you through two real life examples from the fraternity and sorority life community at Ball State, as well as a Sigma Alpha Epsilon chapter at the University of Georgia. So the first thing you need to do in the Bright Spot framework is think about a common chapter challenge. We just talked about that. What is a problem that you think could be solved by a change in practices or behavior, not by throwing money at it. So in our Vietnamese malpractice story that I shared earlier, the worker that was, tasked with solving this problem, he was up against such a huge challenge, and there was no way that he was going to be able to throw money at that. He had to have a change in behavior or practices or process. The second thing you need to do is gather the data. So dive into the data and see what it reveals. Does the data show that somebody has potentially solved a problem that you've identified, meaning that the problem does not exist there? So there is some data gathering that has to happen here. And again, this is why your chapter structure is so prime for the Bright Spot methodology, because you have access to your chapters that you all want to elevate and grow and learn and improve. You have access to that. That's gold. If you're an organization where you're looking to do something differently, but you have to go interact with people that have no obligation to talk to you, it gets much more difficult to do step number 2. The third step here is study the data to find the bright spots. So after you gather all the data, you bring it in, you analyze your data, and you start to find the chapters that are performing better than others in areas of concern. You're not looking for perfect. I think that's a really important thing to call out here, is you're not looking for chapters to be perfect. You're looking for the best of the bunch. So who could also look, you could also look for exceptions to the norm. So if there's an area where people are pretty mediocre across the board, where's just the exception, the one that's doing a little bit better? And that can be your place to start. The fourth step here is understanding the normal way of doing something. So to best illustrate this, going back to our malnutrition example, the aid worker recognized that the normal way of doing things was working in the rice paddies, serving 2 meals a day, with those meals consisting mostly of rice. So when he saw the other individuals who were harvesting the shrimp and the crabs, he knew that they were outliers. He knew that that was different, and that was something that the others weren't doing. But he first had to understand that baseline. So that's a really critical step in the framework. The fifth thing here, the fifth step, is to study the bright spots to find what they're doing differently. So when he saw that there was outliers and there were people or families that had children who were not suffering from malnutrition, he was able to hone in on those families and observe them in a different way and say, okay, your families are meeting the health, the recommended health criteria. What are you doing differently? And he was able to observe those families through that lens versus those that were doing the norm. The sixth step here is to make sure none of your bright spots are exceptional in some way. So this one's really important because sometimes a chapter can look like a bright spot, but you find that they might be doing something exceptional, meaning that they might just have a highly motivated chapter officer who's super motivated and awesome and goes above and beyond in everything that they do. And maybe they have a natural charisma about them. You can't clone natural charisma. Just like if you have a fundraising scenario and you have a chapter that's blowing everybody out of the water, if somebody has a rich aunt or uncle who has donated an extremely large sum of money, that's not something you can replicate. Therefore, that chapter is eliminated as a bright spot. And the seventh and final step in the process is to replicate the bright spot. So how do you take what's working and break it out in a way that can be cloned or replicated and shared with other chapters? So before we go into the examples here, I just want to say that I'll give a little bit of a disclaimer that we did not actually go out and do the research to determine whether or not the examples we're sharing with you are truly bright spots. These were examples that caught our eye, and they seemed like bright spots. So we outlined how we would approach it and how we would use the framework in order to prove out whether they were or disprove their bright spot tendency. So the first example here comes from Ball State University. There was an article recently that we saw where their fraternity and sorority life reported a 91.1% retention rate last year throughout the pandemic. And that was very interesting because we know that many organizations and schools have suffered from membership loss in the past year. So how did they achieve that 91%? And more importantly, how did they achieve it with it being 12.7% higher than it was the previous year? So what did they do? There's something going on here that's interesting. On the surface, they look like they might be a bright spot. And we also know, thanks to the article, that their councils were highly involved with the students and the fraternity sorority life department in general. We know that they were providing academic support. We know that they were finding member engagement opportunities and sharing those with chapters. We know that they were providing some recruitment support in terms of virtual resources and how they go about recruiting members and messaging and that sort of thing. So if we take that example and we start plugging it into the framework, we know that the fraternity sorority life retention was high at Ball State, which may not have been the case for all campuses during COVID-19. So the key problem statement that we identified here became, how do you keep members engaged and retained during challenging times, such as COVID-19? Because we know that COVID-19 isn't going to be the only challenge that comes our way, right? There's going to be other challenging times that come up that force us to think differently and solve challenges. So in this instance, it looks like Ball State might be one of those exceptions. So we want to dive into that and say, well, what are they doing that has driven this success that other campuses might not be doing? So in order to understand what they are doing, we had a few key questions that came to mind because we know that engagement and perceived value leads to retention. So what is Ball State doing in terms of hosting activities for members to engage in? What types of activities? Are there any different activities or actions that they're taking this year or took this past year compared to previous years? And then what additional value is being provided to members? What did they add to the mix? What did they change up? So note that as you start to ask yourselves these questions in the process, your data can be qualitative or quantitative. As we explored examples over the past few months in multiple different organizations, we've found that qualitative data is much more common and more accessible than the quantitative. So you will be able to explore that and use that. And like I said, this is a framework. So that doesn't mean you have to follow it to a T. Use it in a way that works for you. And if that means qualitative data, then that's perfectly fine. So steps 2 and 3 here, as we look at the Ball State example, we know that they had their 91.9% retention. So we have that data. We know that they had the 12.7% increase in retention from the previous year. And we also know from the article that was shared that they had over 700 hours of community service from fraternity and sorority life members in the past year. So I know that this can sound like a lot, but you need to be able to go out and access this data. So if I was a fraternity and sorority life director at another campus, I would want to understand, okay, Ball State, how did you do this? What was it? What's all the data that you have? And I would want to go to other campuses and other directors and say, what are your stats? What are you seeing? How are you measuring success this year? I know it's been a weird year. I would love to see how we compare to other campuses. And I think when you're going out and gathering and studying data from your chapters, there's multiple ways that you can go out and access this data. You can send out pulse surveys or polls if you have awards, chapter awards, your award submission forms can be a great mechanism to collect data. So don't shy away from that and optimize it to the best of your ability. If you're hosting chapter officer meetings with headquarters to stay connected, you can use those as an opportunity to collect some of that qualitative anecdotal information. Don't forget to leverage your chapter or your leadership consultants to connect with chapters and ask some key questions about what might be working in chapters. See if they can find some case studies or examples of things that are happening really well while they're out in the field. And obviously, last but not least, you can always call or email your chapters and reach out to your officers and say, hey, we noticed that your recruitment numbers are up this year. What did you guys do? What did that look like? Can you share with us your process? So going out and gathering and studying this data is a key part of moving the framework forward. So step number 4 is understanding the normal way things are done. So if you wanted to understand how Ball State achieved these results and whether they are truly a bright spot or not, you would need to understand the normal way things are done. So in this instance, that means how are fraternity and sorority life departments at other campuses engaging members, adding value, and retaining members. So you would want to get data from campuses of similar size, because if you go out and you just reach out to everybody, you're going to get a lot of variance. So you do want to try to stay within certain parameters so that you don't get major outliers or have influence from campuses that might not make sense. So for example, Ball State and Alabama are probably going to be very different. But you would want to maybe understand retention rates. You would maybe want to look at their community service hours and their other engagement metrics. And you would also want to look at what types of support the fraternity and sorority life departments are providing and how is it being delivered. And also look at the councils. We know that the councils, the IFCs, NPCs, and PHCs were very involved at Ball State. So how do you tap into the councils and understand what those councils are doing as well to provide support to chapters? And step number 5 is study the bright spots. So now that you have that data from Ball State, you have information from other campuses, start to look at that data and say, okay, what is Ball State doing compared to these other campuses? What's different? How we'd want to look at things like what was different versus those previous years? What were their community service hours like? And what was that compared to? What did that look like compared to previous years? And also your past retention rates and trends, like I mentioned. So there's lots of other data that you would want to dig into, but these are the ones that bubbled to the top at Ball State. And going into that exception world, the exceptions are key. So you need to know that there isn't something unusual or exceptional going on. So in the case of Ball State, for example, if somebody had a relative that worked at a local nonprofit and helped organize a community service day that maybe they wouldn't have normally done for other groups, that allowed them to achieve an excessive amount of hours towards that 700 hours number, that would be an exceptional connection, which is this first bullet point right here. Exceptional connections are going to throw off the Bright Spots framework. Unrealistic budgets. So if Ball State or chapters at Ball State had an exceptionally large budget, maybe for some tech that allowed them to provide resources that other campuses may not be able to afford, that would eliminate them as a bright spot, because you can't just magically make budgets appear. It's not something that you can replicate. And obviously special circumstances is another one. There's always going to be outliers and special situations, and it's important to uncover those. So if the fraternity and sorority life department at Ball State won a grant that allowed them to hire a resource to help develop strategies and new resources that they could deliver to chapters that otherwise wouldn't be possible without that hire or that grant money, that is a special circumstance. Those are the types of things you want to uncover. And the final step, step number 7, is finding a way to reproduce the bright spot among chapters or individuals. So once you know what led to the success of a bright spot chapter, you can then say, this was the process they took, this is how it was executed, and this is how it was delivered. And you can replicate that, whether it's building templates, you can host trainings. So you can teach other chapter officers or advisors on how to implement similar strategies. You can always use your leadership conferences as an opportunity to highlight bright spots, or at your convention. It's a great time to have those discussions when when members and officers are looking to learn. And also you can create templates or toolkits. So for example, if a chapter is doing a phenomenal job and they are a bright spot when it comes to their fundraising, how are they messaging it? What type of coaching are they giving to their members to go out and make the asks? Are there email templates you could provide? So really looking at how you can turn the bright spot process or exceptions into something tangible. So going into our next example, well, first, if you have any questions about the Ball State one or want to have any other information on that, definitely ping us. We'd love to have some discussion about it. But go ahead and throw that into the chat. And our second example here is the Sigma Alpha Epsilon chapter at University of Georgia. So just a little bit of background on them before we dive into the framework and how it fits into everything. So they do an annual fundraiser every year in honor of their past chapter president. He was diagnosed with leukemia, and he passed away I believe when he left the chapter in 1971. So ever since then, this chapter has been hosting this annual fundraiser. The funds that they raise go to the Leukemia and Lymphoma Society. So for a really good cause, obviously the more money they can raise, the better. And this past year, they raised $110,000, which was highlighted in a fraternal newsletter that we received. And we said, seems like something's going on here that could be exceptional and could be a bright spot. I had to be careful how I use exceptional because there's exceptions and then there's bright spots, but they look like they could be a bright spot. So we are saying, well, if we were looking to just uncover whether they are truly a bright spot or not, what would that look like? What approach would we take? So we said, first off, the problem here would be, well, how do you raise more dollars per chapter? Because like we said before, if every chapter can just raise a little bit more, whether it's for the general fund, whether it's for your philanthropy, whatever that is, that creates a larger impact for your organization. And it also drives more purpose for your members and for your officers. It makes them feel good, like they are contributing to their community, and it adds value. And then the second step, which is to gather and study the data, we said, well, if we were looking to say, is this a bright spot or not, we would go out to all the other Sigma Alpha Epsilon chapters and say, what are they raising in their annual fundraisers or in their fundraising efforts across the board? And how do they compare? And we'd probably want to look at universities of larger size because it is University of Georgia. Obviously, the larger universities are, I won't say obviously, but most likely, the universities of that size are going to be fundraising more than Alma College. There is proportions and scale that you have to take in consideration. The third thing we would do is we would evaluate how things are normally done. So while going out and talking to these chapters and getting this data, we would want to understand what fundraising tactics are they deploying? Are they using social media? Are they using a crowdfunding platform? Do they use donation links? What does that look like? What technology are they using to gather and capture the donations, if any? And then also, what type of coaching and support are they providing to their members? Because going out and asking for donations can be kind of a scary, intimidating thing. Is there something different that they're doing to prep their members to go out and make those asks, or how to share their fundraising links and donation pages and what have you that they might have in place? The fourth thing would be to study the bright spot. So we would dive into the University of Georgia chapter and say, okay, here's what everybody else is doing. Here are the technologies they're using. Here are the tactics they're using and the strategies. What is the University of Georgia doing over here? And how does that compare to what the rest of the chapters are doing? Is it the same? Because if it's the same, then maybe there's some exceptions that we need to dig into. But if there's things that are different, you might have a bright spot that you can continue to dive into and continue to ask questions of that Georgia chapter and say, what's working here and why is it working the way it is? And why is it excelling over other chapters? Whoops. So step number 5 is the exceptions. Like I said, does the presumed bright spot have any exceptions? So do they, my computer got a little ahead of me. There we go. So does the bright spot have any exceptions? So did somebody have a wealthy aunt or uncle who contributed $50,000? Did they have, did they have a Instagram account with 50,000 followers because one of their members is an influencer that they were able to leverage to, collect a larger amount of donations? So looking at those exceptions would be the step number 5 that you would dig into. And then step number 6 here is replicate. So if you're able to eliminate any exceptions and say, yes, this chapter is a bright spot, Now you would say, well, what is the University of Georgia chapter doing that's different than the other chapters? And how can we share those things that are different with other chapters? Is it a specific technology? Is it a specific social media platform that's working well for them? Is it the way in which they're coaching their members to go out and make the donation asks? Is it the way they engage with students on campus to solicit those donations? You can really dive in, and then you can create playbooks or templates and recommendations that you can then provide to those other chapters. So the really cool thing about the Bright Spot framework is that it's extremely versatile, and it can be applied to multiple different areas within your operation and your organization. The first one that really comes to mind for me, I guess is the one that always comes to mind for me first off, is recruiting. How can you apply the Bright Spot method to your recruiting tactics? Do you have a chapter that's been highly successful in their recruitment efforts? What are they doing? How are they connecting with students on campus? How are they promoting themselves? What type of events are they hosting? Obviously now virtual and in person, you're going to have to look at that, right? And see what the differences are and what's changed and whether COVID impacted things. But it's a perfect time to dive into these and say, well, what's working in this environment? And then how can we take elements of that, because we know that this environment isn't going to go away immediately overnight. The next area where I really see an opportunity for Bright Spots to be used is in member engagement tactics. So do you have a chapter that has extremely high retention numbers? It'd be very interesting to see what types of activities do they host? What do their chapter meetings look like and how are they structured? What are the relationships between the members and how were those cultivated when members first joined the chapter? So digging into that, and I think you can definitely uncover some bright spots in this area. The third area, an example, would be fundraising. So looking exactly like we looked at in the Sigma Alpha Epsilon example a moment ago. How can you look at your fundraising efforts across your chapters and find the ones that are doing something amazing and replicate it across the others, just to get those incremental changes? Like we said before, if each chapter could just do a little bit more, a little bit better, what does that mean for your organization? It can really add up to those large sum changes. And then last but not least, the fourth area that I really identified here that can be an area to leverage your bright spots is with volunteers. So do you have any particular advisors whose chapters always seem to be running like a well-oiled machine, like those ones who just have it down, things run so smoothly, when you need something, they're there, when they're the way they support their chapter officers, the way they support the members. And what processes and philosophies could you take from that and replicate across other chapters and other advisors? Or since you can't change people per se, because I know personality is often a big piece of this one, how can you update your volunteer recruiting practices to find individuals with similar characteristics? If you've analyzed those strong advisors, what does an awesome volunteer look like? A really good resource for this actually would be Mariner Management. Her name is Peggy Hoffman. Her and her husband run a consulting company called Mariner Management, and they do a lot of work with volunteers. Bill Highway partners with them very frequently on a lot of different projects, and they have some awesome resources on volunteers and how do you profile good volunteers? What does that look like? How do you get the right ones in the right spots? How do you train volunteers properly? They have a lot of resources, so I highly recommend checking them out as well if you're looking to dig into this one a little bit deeper. So upon that, hopefully you've been sitting here listening and following along through the examples, and I'm going to guess and go out on a limb, maybe not, but think that you might have had a bright spot chapter or 2 or 3 come to mind. So if you did, what are those chapters excelling at? Or chapter if you only had one. What are they excelling at? What problem are they solving that other chapters have and may be struggling with? Because you might have a bright spot chapter on your hands that you can then go seek and ask questions to. And then what you would want to dive into is, what are those specific actions or activities or programs, processes that are leading to their success? How can you understand that and learn more about how they're operating? What questions do you need to ask, and how do you need to ask them? Because sometimes it's not about what questions, sometimes it's about how you ask it. So last but not least, winding down here, looks like we're going to finish a little bit early, but we'll definitely have time for questions if anybody has any. This is the opportunity for you to take the framework and walk away from this webinar and say, how can I apply this? So the key questions that you should be walking away with here are to write down a challenge or problem that you have consistently seen across your chapters that you haven't really found a good solution for yet. Second thing I want you to do is recognize, do you know of any chapters that do not have this problem? Because if you do, that might be a potential bright spot for you to dig into. Number 3, once you walk away from here, think about, do you have any data or information, whether qualitative or quantitative, it can be either or, that you could look at to validate or confirm that this chapter is performing better than others when it comes to this issue? So what is the problem that you're looking to solve? Do you have any chapters that may have already solved it and are not experiencing the problem? And do you have any data to confirm whether or not that chapter is actually outperforming the other chapters in this area? And then last but not least, what steps do you want to take to explore this potential bright spot in more depth? Are you going to reach out to the chapter officer and ask some questions? Are you going to dig into some data internally? Are you going to connect with a leadership consultant that has recently visited that chapter to ask some questions about what they saw, what they observed, and what their interactions with the chapter were like? What are the steps you're going to take to prove out whether this chapter is a bright spot or not? So with that, whoops, went a little faster. With that, I'm going to open it up to Q&A. I think this went a little bit quicker than anticipated, which is okay. Everybody loves a little bit of time back to their day. So are there any questions that anyone has? You can go ahead and drop those in the chat, and Katie will go ahead and monitor that for me. No, all right, we're not seeing any come through, and that's okay. Sometimes people can be a little shy. So if you do have any questions or you think of something when you walk away from here today, we will be sending out the deck and the recording. So you will have all of the information and you will have the slides. So don't hesitate to reach out and ask any questions if you have anything further you'd like to follow up on. Again, my name is Charlotte Myler. My email is here. Don't hesitate to reach out. Katie Carson can also be a resource for you if you would like. She's our marketing lead, and her email is also listed here. So with that, everybody, hopefully you learned something new here today. If not, hopefully you learned something that you can apply and take with you. And we are here to help. We are here to be a resource. And don't hesitate to reach out. We hope everybody has a great rest of your day, and we will talk to you next time. Bye, everybody.